Do you think our ultra-conservative 6-3 Supreme Court rules in favor of most Americans, or do you think it rules in favor of excuse me, big money? Well, my name is Dean. I'm here to keep it real because our insane times need reality. The Supreme Court, which is made up of justices mostly appointed by the Bushes and Donald Trump, clearly rules in favor of the top 1% and the billionaire Epstein class. Now, back in June, there was a case in which one of the three members of the minority of this court, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, appointed by President Biden, issued a blistering dissent, and it was a 7-2 case, I believe the article here says it was. The article I'm reading here is on Yahoo News, titled, excuse me, SCOTUS Justice's blistering dissent vindicated by bombshell study. And in June, Ketanji Brown Jackson issued a blistering dissent in which the justices held 7-2. The oil and gas companies had legal standing to challenge California's environmental regulations requiring automakers to produce more electric vehicles and fewer gasoline-powered ones. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson wrote, this case gives fodder to the unfortunate perception that moneyed interests enjoy an easier road to relief in this court than ordinary citizens. Brown Jackson wrote, I worry that the fuel industry's gain comes at a reputational cost for this court, which is already viewed by many as being overly sympathetic to corporate interest. Now, a little background on this issue. This court, excuse me, this court has been definitely captured by the billionaire interests in the far right. There's a book by Senator Sheldon Whitehouse from Rhode Island titled The Scheme, How the Right Wing Used Dark Money to Capture the Supreme Court. And what this is talking about is how the billionaire-funded Federalist Society created lists of judicial nominees that were used by the Bush administrations and even more so the Trump administration, in which they kind of vetted and favored candidates that they believe would rule in the interests of billionaires, giant corporations, and other agendas of the far right. They were very successful at doing this and supporting the candidacies of Bush Sr. and George W. Bush, and then later on Donald Trump in 2016. They supported Romney in 2012 and John McCain in 2008, but they didn't get elected. As a result, their preferred candidates that adhered to their agenda and passed their litmus tests were nominated to the Supreme Court. So we have a court that's very far right, very much in favor of the financial interest of the billionaire class and large corporations, basically the money over people. It's basically money over people if you want to really simplify it. And what this article talks about, I'll just read part of this. A new study has bolstered a scathing dissent by liberal Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson that warned the court appeared to favor the rich, just like I read a minute ago. The study, published Monday by National Bureau of Economic Research, investigated whether the Supreme Court has contributed to rising income inequality by ruling in favor of policies that favor wealthy parties. Its authors, two academics from Columbia University in New York and one from Yale University, found that in cases pitting the rich against the poor, Republican appointees were far more likely than their Democratic colleagues to side with the wealthier party. Back in 1953, Democratic and Republican appointees were statistically indistinguishable on the issue, with justices appointed by members of both parties favoring the rich in 45% of cases on average. By 2022, the Republican-appointed justice was voting in favor of the rich by a whopping 70% of the time. the average Democratic justice cast a pro-rich vote, which was defined as a vote that would directly shift resources from the party that was more likely to be wealthy, including votes that supported businesses over consumers or workers just 35% of the time. So you see 70% versus 35%. Republican appointed justices are twice as likely to vote in favor of the interests of big money corporations than those justices appointed by the Democrats. So the article says the results reveal a steady increase in polarization, mostly due to Republican appointees whose decisions rise from about 50% pro-rich share to a 70% pro-rich share over the course of 70 years, the study's authors wrote. The findings also supported a June dissent, as I read earlier. So the interesting thing here is it's very clear that the wealth and money issues, wealth and money interests that have captured the court, going all the way back to the 80s when the the Citizens United ruling was handed down that basically allowed politicians to take unlimited number of legal bribes, so-called campaign contributions, from corporate interests. That allowed corporate interests to buy our elections and ultimately help buy the presidential elections and put in office politicians who would nominate, appoint, and confirm far-right judicial candidates to the Supreme Court and the federal courts. And that has shifted the federal judiciary to rule much more in favor, as you can see from this study. While that is true in the Supreme Court, that Republican-appointed justices are now twice as likely to rule in favor of the billionaire class on key decisions, I would guess that that's probably equally as true, if not more so, when you look at all of the other levels of the federal judiciary, which have been heavily stocked with judicial nominees appointed by Republican presidents. And in this case, we're talking Donald Trump, George W. Bush, and even some that are still in office that were appointed by George Bush Sr. and Ronald Reagan in the 80s. There's still a few justices from that era that remain on the court, but certainly a number of justices that were appointed during the two terms of George W. Bush from 2001 to 2009, and the Trump administration that took office in January of 2017, as well as the current Trump presidency that began in January of last year. So elections do have consequences, and whether they're elections that have been bought with billions of dollars of billionaire money, we see that this has purchased a judiciary and a Supreme Court that rules heavily in favor of the interest of the very billionaire class that legally bribed these politicians to appoint the people that they wanted appointed. And elections do have consequences. And for the future, voters need to realize that we should be voting for the party that will nominate justices and judges that will rule in favor of citizens, rule in favor of workers, rule in favor of the environment, rule in favor of individuals that should be getting justice from the system, and not just those who can buy justice by contributing more money. But our current system, especially that when it's run by a billionaire-aligned Republican Party of the far right that rules in favor of and works in favor of the billionaire class in the top 1%, we can see that the result we get is policies that favor the ultra-wealthy and favor large corporations and favor billionaires, and rule on the side of the Epstein class and the politicians that are in alliance with that. And this is what we get. We get far-right policy that is not in the interests of most of us as individuals. You get rulings on these cases where large corporations are allowed to underpay workers and allow for poor working conditions and side with billionaire corporations and the wealthy over the interests of workers and unions and consumers and the environment. So as long as we keep voting for these right-wing politicians who will represent the top 1%, this is what we're going to get. If we the people start voting for candidates who represent our interests rather than those of the top 1% and the billionaires, then the politicians will follow. And that's why elections are important, and we need to vote, and we need to vote for pro-citizen candidates who advocate reform agendas and reform policies that work for us rather than the top 1%. So I thank you all for watching, and please do the YouTube stuff and subscribe and ring the bell, and hope to see you back here for more reality-based news, because like I say, I'm here to keep it real.